An American bomber flew straight over a Japanese aircraft carrier in 1942, and the Japanese Navy couldn't shoot it down. Not because they lacked guns, not because they were surprised, but because pulling the trigger would have destroyed their own flagship. That 3-second mistake didn't sink a single ship. It didn't score a single torpedo hit. And yet, it helped set in motion the collapse of Japan's carrier fleet at Midway. Most people think the Battle of Midway was decided by dive bombers. Almost no one talks about the low-flying bomber that forced an admiral to hesitate and make the wrong decision under pressure. This is the story of a mission that failed tactically, survived against all odds, and still managed to change the course of the Pacific War in a way few historians fully explain. If you stay until the end, you'll understand why one aircraft flying too low to shoot mattered more than thousands of rounds of anti-aircraft fire. By 0700 on June 4, 1942, the Battle of Midway had already entered a phase no war plan could control. Japan's carrier force was exactly where it was supposed to be. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, operated northwest of Midway Island, protected by a dense screen of escorts. This was the same force that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Its doctrine emphasized order, preparation, and decisive air power. The objective was straightforward: destroy Midway's airfield, force the American carriers to respond, then eliminate them in a single engagement. What the doctrine did not account for was what happens when the defender has nothing left to lose. Midway was a fixed target. It could not maneuver, withdraw, or recover. When Japanese aircraft began their attack, the American garrison understood a simple reality. If Midway lost its air capability, the battle would end before it truly began. Waiting was not an option. There was no coordinated strike package available, no time to build one. Aircraft were launched as they became ready. Different types, different altitudes, different missions. The goal was not efficiency, it was disruption. Among the aircraft launched were 4 Army Air Force's B-26 Marauders. The B-26 was not designed for torpedo attacks. It had never been intended to fly at wave-top height into a carrier formation. Its performance margins were narrow, its handling unforgiving. Early accident rates had already given it a reputation for killing inexperienced pilots. None of that changed on June 4th. The aircraft were armed with torpedoes weighing nearly 2,000 pounds, an improvised solution to an immediate problem. Training was minimal. Coordination with Navy torpedo tactics was non-existent. The crews understood this before takeoff. They also understood what had already happened to Navy torpedo squadrons earlier that morning. Those attacks had failed completely. Almost every aircraft had been destroyed before reaching effective release range. The lesson was obvious. A conventional approach meant near certain death. The B-26 crews launched anyway. On the Japanese carriers, the situation appeared stable. Nagumo's aircraft were being recovered and rearmed. Combat air patrol fighters orbited above the fleet. Anti-aircraft batteries were fully manned. The system was functioning as designed. Incoming American attacks were detected early and classified correctly. Small groups, poor coordination, low probability of success. None of the attackers scored a hit. From a tactical perspective, the threat was limited. But limited threats still demanded responses. Fighters were pulled down from altitude to intercept low-level attackers. Ships maneuvered repeatedly to avoid torpedoes that missed but forced changes in course. Fire control crews tracked targets approaching from unexpected angles. Each response consumed attention. Each maneuver disrupted formation. Each interception altered the geometry of defense. This mattered more than the lack of hits suggested. Carrier defense doctrine assumed predictable attack profiles. Altitude separation, clear firing arcs, defined engagement zones. What it did not handle well was an aircraft approaching so low and so close that those assumptions broke down. The B-26 seconds were not fast enough to outrun fighters. They were not agile enough to evade sustained fire. They had no technical advantage. Their only advantage was that no one had planned for them to do what they were about to do. As one of those bombers closed on the Japanese formation, its pilot faced a decision with no correct answer. Turn away and be destroyed by fighters. Pull up and enter layered anti-aircraft fire. Or remain low. and accept that survival would depend on a reaction the enemy had never rehearsed. The Japanese gunners, meanwhile, faced a different problem. Their weapons were optimized to kill aircraft at range, at altitude, with space to track, lead, and fire. They were not optimized to fire at a target that might crash into their own flight deck. Within minutes, that conflict between capability and consequence would matter more than firepower, because one American bomber was about to enter a zone where shooting it down was no longer a purely tactical decision. B-26 crews did not discover the Japanese carriers by surprise. They found them because the fleet was impossible to miss. 4 carriers, steaming in formation, surrounded by escorts. Wake lines cut clean arcs across the Pacific. Black dots of fighters circled above like insects guarding a carcass. From a distance, it looked orderly, controlled, untouchable. Up close, it looked lethal. The B-26 Marauder was already operating outside its design limits. Loaded with a torpedo, it flew heavy. At low altitude, every control input mattered. The margin between controlled flight and disaster was thin even in training. Over open ocean, under fire, it was thinner. There was no formation integrity to rely on. Each aircraft flew its own approach, separated by necessity rather than plan. Communication was minimal. Radios were unreliable. There was no second pass planned. No contingency if the attack failed. This was not a coordinated strike. It was a series of individual decisions unfolding at high speed. As the bombers closed the distance, Japanese fighters descended to intercept. Zeros had advantages the B-26 could not counter. Better climb, better maneuverability, superior numbers. The American aircraft could not outrun them and could not outturn them. The only option left was altitude, down. Wave-top flying removed some angles of attack. It also introduced new risks. Salt spray reduced visibility. Small errors became fatal. At this height, an engine failure meant immediate impact. There was no room to recover. The crews accepted this because the alternative was worse. At higher altitude, anti-aircraft fire was layered and overlapping. At medium altitude, fighters could engage with freedom. Low altitude offered only one uncertain advantage: hesitation. As the B-26 seconds dropped closer to the surface, Japanese gunners tracked them. Fire control solutions adjusted. Tracers began to reach out. The volume of fire increased steadily, not as a single wall, but as a growing density of threat. This was the point where training normally dictated withdrawal. The aircraft were already damaged. Hits punched through fuselage skins. Control cables vibrated. Engines absorbed fragments meant for something else. Smoke appeared and disappeared in brief pulses, leaving crews unsure whether systems were failing or merely stressed. None of that changed the mission. The torpedo release profile required a straight, stable run. Deviate too early, and the weapon would fail. Release too late, and there would be no escape path. Every second closer to the fleet reduced options. Ahead, the largest carrier in the formation grew rapidly in the windscreen. Akagi, flagship, center of command. Its flight deck stretched long and flat, an obvious aiming point, and a psychological anchor. That was where the decision crystallized. Standard doctrine dictated a release, then a breakaway maneuver designed to minimize exposure. But the approach geometry had already collapsed. The bomber was too low, too close, and too slow to execute a clean escape. Turning away now meant exposing the aircraft's broadside to concentrated fire. Pulling up meant climbing directly into fighters, repositioning above the fleet. Neither option offered a survivable path. The pilot understood this without analysis. There was no time for one. The aircraft continued forward. At this range, anti-aircraft fire intensified. Guns on the carrier and its escorts fired simultaneously. Tracers converged. Explosions bracketed the approach. The bomber shook as rounds struck structure and systems. Control forces changed. The aircraft felt heavier, less responsive. Still, it held course. The torpedo was released. The sudden loss of weight altered the aircraft's balance. The nose lifted slightly. For a fraction of a second, there was space to maneuver. This was the moment where doctrine expected withdrawal. Instead, the pilot made a different choice. He turned toward the carrier, not because it was aggressive, not because it was heroic, but because every other direction was worse. Flying directly toward the flight deck eliminated lead angles. It compressed reaction time. It forced gunners to confront a problem their weapons were never meant to solve. An aircraft approaching so close that firing carried immediate risk to the ship itself. As the B-26 closed the final distance, the carrier's deck filled the windscreen. Details resolved, rapidly parked aircraft, deck equipment, personnel moving without cohesion. Some gunners continued firing. Others hesitated. At this distance, a missed shot did not disappear into the sea. It struck wood, steel, fuel, or men. The bomber descended further. At masthead height, there was no margin left. The aircraft was no longer executing an attack profile. It was executing a collision avoidance problem at nearly 280 miles per hour. The carrier's bow rose sharply. For an instant, the aircraft's path and the ship's structure overlapped in a way that left no room for error. Then the bomber crossed the deck. The flight deck passed beneath in seconds. Turbulence from the bomber's propellers rippled across the surface. Men dropped flat. Equipment shifted. The moment was loud, violent, and disorienting, and then it was over. The aircraft cleared the carrier and continued on, damaged but intact, leaving behind confusion instead of destruction. No ship had been sunk. No torpedo had hit. From a tactical standpoint, nothing had been achieved. But something important had just been revealed. Japan's overwhelming firepower had encountered a situation where using it was no longer straightforward, and the implications of that hesitation would not become clear until much later. The Japanese Navy did not fail to shoot down the B-26 because it lacked weapons. It failed because its weapons were designed for a different problem. Carrier defense in 1942 was built around distance. Fighters intercepted attackers far from the fleet. Anti-aircraft guns engaged targets at predictable altitudes and approach angles. The entire system assumed time to track, time to lead, time to correct. The B-26 removed time from the equation. At masthead height, an aircraft traveling nearly 280 miles per hour crosses lethal distances in seconds. At that speed and altitude, standard fire control solutions begin to break down. Gun crews are trained to calculate lead based on predictable motion. What they faced instead was a target that compressed reaction windows to fractions of a second. At long range, missing is acceptable. At short range, missing becomes dangerous. Japanese carriers carried dense anti-aircraft batteries, but those guns had limits. Many mounts had restricted firing arcs, designed to avoid striking the ship itself. At low angles, shells could ricochet. A round that missed its target could strike the flight deck, the island structure, or parked aircraft loaded with fuel. The closer the bomber came, the more those risks increased. This created a problem no gunnery manual solved. Fire control doctrine assumes that firing is always preferable to not firing. But doctrine also assumes the firing platform is not directly in the line of risk. On a carrier deck crowded with aircraft, fuel lines, and personnel, that assumption collapses quickly. As the B-26 approached, some gunners continued firing. Others hesitated. That hesitation was not cowardice. It was calculation under pressure. At that distance, a single shell detonating on deck could cause more damage than the aircraft itself. The risk was not hypothetical. Japanese carriers were vulnerable to secondary explosions. Aircraft were fueled. Ordnance was staged for rearming. Damage control doctrine emphasized preventing fires above all else. A catastrophic fire on the flight deck could immobilize a carrier even without a direct hit from the enemy. This meant that every gun crew faced a choice with consequences beyond the immediate threat: shoot and risk destroying your own ship, hold fire, and hope the aircraft passes. That decision had to be made in seconds. Above the fleet, fighter aircraft were no longer positioned to intervene. Combat air patrol had been drawn down to intercept earlier, low-level attacks. Fighters excelled at altitude, where speed and maneuverability mattered most. At masthead height, they had no room to dive safely without overshooting or risking collision with ships. The B-26 existed in a narrow vertical zone where neither fighters nor anti-aircraft guns were optimized to operate. This was not a gap anyone had planned to exploit. It was a gap created by desperation. The carrier's own structure further complicated the problem. As the bomber closed in, it aligned briefly with the length of the flight deck. From that angle, firing solutions forced gunners to aim across the ship rather than away from it. A miss in that direction did not disappear into the ocean. It stayed aboard. Even hits carried risk. A damaged aircraft crashing onto the deck could ignite fuel, block launch operations, or kill command personnel. The closer the aircraft came, the more catastrophic any outcome became, regardless of who fired the shot. This inverted the normal logic of defense. At long range, destruction is clean. At close range, destruction is unpredictable. The Japanese Navy understood this instinctively, even if it had never written it down. As the B-26 crossed the carrier, the ship's firepower did not vanish. It became constrained. Guns could fire, but firing carried unacceptable consequences. The difference between capability and usability mattered more than raw strength. That distinction is rarely discussed in accounts of Midway. Histories often focus on numbers: aircraft launched, bombs dropped, ships sunk. They treat firepower as something that either exists or does not. What they rarely examine is the moment when firepower exists but cannot be applied safely. This was one of those moments. The bomber passed over the deck not because Japanese defenses were weak, but because they were too powerful to use recklessly. In the seconds that followed, confusion replaced clarity. Reports conflicted. Some crews believed the aircraft had been destroyed. Others reported near misses. There was no immediate damage assessment because there was no damage to assess. What remained was the impression. An American bomber had penetrated the heart of the fleet. Not with precision, not with coordination, but with proximity. That mattered more than the lack of physical damage suggested. In warfare, perception shapes decisions as much as outcomes. Nagumo had just witnessed something his doctrine had not prepared him to see: an enemy willing to accept total exposure to force a reaction. From his position on the bridge, the encounter reinforced a growing concern. Attacks from Midway were not organized, but they were persistent. Aircraft were arriving at different altitudes, from different directions, with no regard for loss rates. This suggested that Midway's air capability had not been neutralized. It suggested that more attacks were likely. And it suggested that the next attack might not be as survivable as the last. That conclusion did not come from analysis. It came from experience. The bomber did not sink a carrier. It did not cripple the fleet. It did not achieve its tactical objective. But it forced a realization that would shape the decisions made in the next critical minutes. Because when a commander believes an enemy remains capable of attack, every assumption about timing, rearming, and readiness changes. And those changes, made under pressure, would soon matter far more than a single aircraft flying too low to shoot. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo did not make his critical decision in a vacuum. He made it inside a system that was already under strain. By the time the B-26 crossed Akagi's flight deck, Nagumo's carrier force was in the middle of a complex transition. Aircraft from the initial strike on Midway were returning low on fuel and ammunition. Some needed immediate recovery. Others required rearming. Deck crews were already working at maximum tempo. Carrier warfare depends on rhythm. Launch, recover, rearm, launch again. Disrupt that rhythm, and even the most powerful fleet begins to lose flexibility. Nagumo's standing orders were clear. His primary mission was to destroy American carriers. Midway itself was secondary. But doctrine also required him to neutralize threats that could interfere with that objective. The problem was uncertainty. Japanese reconnaissance had failed to locate American carriers with precision. Reports were delayed, incomplete, or ambiguous. In the absence of confirmed enemy carrier positions, Nagumo had to assume that Midway-based aircraft represented the most immediate danger. The earlier attacks reinforced that assumption. They were poorly coordinated. They scored no hits, but they kept coming. High-altitude bombers, torpedo aircraft, low-level attackers. Each wave failed tactically, but together they created a pattern. Midway was still capable of launching strikes. The B-26's flyover intensified that impression. From Nagumo's perspective, it was not just a close call. It was evidence of persistence. An American aircraft had penetrated the fleet at the lowest possible altitude, ignored conventional survival logic, and reached the flagship itself. That suggested resolve. It also suggested that Midway had not been neutralized. At this point, Nagumo faced a decision with no clean solution. His carriers were already armed for an anti-ship strike. Torpedoes were loaded on aircraft intended to attack American carriers if and when they were found. But launching those aircraft while Midway remained operational carried risk. Midway-based attacks could continue to disrupt recovery operations, damage decks, or force evasive maneuvers at critical moments. Carrier aircraft on deck are vulnerable. So are carriers in the middle of flight operations. Nagumo's doctrine emphasized eliminating threats before committing to decisive action. That logic had worked at Pearl Harbor. It had worked in earlier carrier battles. Under normal circumstances, it was sound. So he ordered a change. Aircraft previously armed with torpedoes were to be rearmed with bombs for another strike against Midway. This was not an impulsive decision. It followed established principles. If Midway could be silenced, the fleet could then focus entirely on locating and destroying American carriers without interference. The cost was time. Rearming carrier aircraft is not a simple process. Torpedoes are heavy and difficult to move. Bombs must be brought up from magazines below decks. Fuel lines, ordnance handlers, and aircraft crews all have to work in sequence. Under ideal conditions, the process took more than an hour. These were not ideal conditions. The fleet was under intermittent attack. Combat air patrol requirements fluctuated. Deck space was limited. Some aircraft needed immediate servicing. Others were queued for later operations. The rearming process began anyway. On the hangar decks, torpedoes were removed and stacked. Bombs were brought up and positioned nearby. Aircraft were repositioned repeatedly to make space. Fuel lines ran across confined areas. Ordnance accumulated in close proximity. This configuration was inherently dangerous. But it was temporary, or so it was supposed to be. Nagumo's decision assumed one critical variable would remain stable: the absence of American carriers in the immediate area. That assumption did not hold. At 0740, a Japanese scout plane reported sighting an American carrier group. The report changed everything. The primary threat had shifted instantly from Midway to the American fleet. The carriers Nagumo had been preparing to strike now required immediate attention. Aircraft needed to be armed with torpedoes again. Nagumo reversed his order. Aircraft that had just begun the rearming process now had to be reconfigured once more. Bombs were moved aside. Torpedoes were brought back. Crews scrambled to undo work that was already partially complete. This was not confusion. It was necessity. But necessity came at a cost. The hangar decks became crowded with mixed ordnance. Bombs sat beside torpedoes. Fuel remained exposed. Aircraft were parked tightly, limiting maneuverability. Damage control capacity was already taxed from earlier attacks. The fleet's internal safety margins narrowed. None of this was visible from the outside. From a distance, Nagumo's carriers still appeared intact. They still launched and recovered aircraft. Fighters still orbited overhead. Anti-aircraft guns remained manned. But internally, the system was stretched. Every additional minute increased risk. Nagumo did not know that American dive bombers were already searching for his fleet. He did not know they would arrive soon. He did not know from which direction. What he did know was that he had just witnessed an attack that challenged his assumptions about threat priority. The B-26's flyover had not caused damage, but it had forced a mental recalibration. Midway was not quiet. Midway was not suppressed. Midway-based aircraft were still willing to attack under extreme conditions. In that context, delaying a strike against Midway earlier had seemed irresponsible. Reversing that delay now seemed unavoidable. The decision was rational. It was also irreversible, because once the fleet entered this transitional state, partially armed, partially rearmed, operating under pressure, it became uniquely vulnerable to a type of attack that had not yet arrived. And when it did arrive, there would be no time left to correct the situation. By the time the American dive bombers arrived, the Japanese carrier force was not defeated. It was exposed. That distinction matters. From the outside, Nagumo's fleet still appeared formidable. Carriers maintained speed. Fighters continued patrols. Anti-aircraft batteries remained intact. There was no visible collapse, no obvious sign of failure. But internally, The system was operating inside a narrow margin it had not been designed to tolerate. The rearming reversals had created a temporary condition, one that existed only for a short period, but one that carried extraordinary risk. Ordnance was no longer isolated. Bombs and torpedoes shared confined spaces. Fuel lines ran across decks crowded with aircraft. Damage control teams were already stretched thin. This was not negligence. It was the unavoidable result of doing too many necessary things at once. Carrier doctrine assumes that such a state will be brief, and that it will not coincide with a major attack. That assumption was about to fail. The American dive bombers did not arrive as part of a perfectly synchronized master plan. They arrived because they kept searching after fuel margins, made continued flight risky. They arrived because they followed indirect clues, ship wakes, smoke, the geometry of movement. They arrived because the earlier attacks had forced the Japanese fleet into tighter formations and more frequent maneuvering. None of this was decisive by itself. Together, it created a path. When the dive bombers finally pushed over into their attack, they encountered a defense system already committed elsewhere. Fighters were at low altitude, having been drawn down repeatedly to counter torpedo and low-level threats. Climbing back to interception height took time they no longer had. Anti-aircraft fire responded immediately, but it faced the same problem it had faced earlier: compressed time and limited angles. Dive bombers attacked from steep angles, giving gunners only seconds to react. This time, seconds were enough. Bombs struck carriers whose internal safety margins had already narrowed. Penetration points mattered less than what waited below. Hangar decks packed with aircraft. Ordnance staged for rearming. Fuel vapor present in confined spaces. The result was not just damage. It was cascading failure. Explosions triggered fires. Fires ignited fuel. Fuel fed more explosions. Damage control systems were overwhelmed not because they were poorly designed, but because they were asked to contain too much at once. Within minutes, carriers that had survived months of combat were no longer salvageable. This is often described as sudden, almost miraculous destruction. It was not. It was the predictable outcome of a system operating outside its design envelope under pressure. And that pressure did not originate with the dive bombers. It originated earlier. It originated with a series of attacks that achieved no hits and inflicted no obvious damage, but forced the fleet to react continuously. Each reaction consumed attention, time, and flexibility. Each adjustment narrowed the margin for error. The B-26 flyover did not open the window by itself, but it widened it. It reinforced the perception that Midway remained a threat. It validated the decision to rearm. It contributed to the sequence of reversals that placed the fleet in its most dangerous configuration at the worst possible moment. This is where simplistic narratives fail. History often assigns victory to the final blow. It rewards the attack that lands the hit and overlooks the actions that shape the conditions under which that hit becomes possible. In reality, battles are decided by accumulation. Pressure accumulates. Errors accumulate. Constraints accumulate. The dive bombers exploited a condition that already existed. They did not create it. That condition existed because Nagumo's fleet had been forced to do too many things at once. Defend against multiple threat profiles, manage flight operations, rearm aircraft, and prepare for an unseen enemy. Every decision made sense in isolation. Together, they produced vulnerability. From the cockpit of the B-26 that had flown over Akagi's deck, none of this was visible. The crew did not know what decisions had been triggered. They did not know how close the fleet was to a breaking point. They did not know that their survival had coincided with a shift in the battle's trajectory. Only that they had escaped. But war does not require participants to understand its effects. It only requires actions to interact. The bomber's pass over the deck did not destroy a carrier. It did not neutralize defenses. It did not alter force ratios. What it did was contribute to a sequence of pressures that removed flexibility at a critical moment. That removal of flexibility is what the dive bombers exploited. By the time the window closed, it was too late. 3 carriers were burning. The balance of air power in the Pacific shifted permanently. A fleet that had defined the early war was reduced to wreckage in minutes. The window had been narrow. It had existed briefly, and it had been created not by brilliance or luck alone, but by the cumulative effect of actions taken under impossible constraints. The B-26 attack was one of those actions, not decisive by itself, but inseparable from the outcome that followed. Clear of the Japanese carriers, the B-26 did not become safe. It became vulnerable in a different way. The aircraft had survived the most dangerous part of the mission not by superiority, but by proximity. That advantage vanished the moment it left the fleet. Ahead lay open ocean. Behind it, fighters regrouped. The bomber was damaged, low, and alone. This was where missions usually ended. The B-26 had taken hits. Control response was degraded. Engine performance was uncertain. Electrical systems flickered in and out. Smoke lingered where it should not have existed at all. None of that changed the immediate problem. The aircraft had to stay airborne. Japanese fighters pursued briefly, then broke off. Fuel state, distance, and shifting priorities pulled them back toward their carriers. That decision saved the bomber, but it did not solve anything else. The B-26 still had to cross more than 100 miles of ocean. At low altitude, there was no glide margin. Any major failure meant impact within seconds. At higher altitude, damaged engines might not hold power long enough to climb. The crew chose stability over safety margins they no longer had. They stayed low. Inside the aircraft, the situation was not orderly. Systems that had worked minutes earlier stopped responding. Gauges contradicted each other. The crew did not know which indications to trust. Damage assessment was incomplete because there had been no time to perform one. This was not a case of heroic calm. It was controlled uncertainty. The pilot's task narrowed to essentials. Keep speed. Keep altitude. Avoid abrupt inputs. Preserve what power remained. There was no tactical picture anymore. Only flight. The crew did not know what had happened behind them. They did not know Japanese carriers were burning. They did not know the balance of the battle had shifted. They did not know that their attack had coincided with a collapse in Japanese operational flexibility. They assumed, reasonably, that the mission had failed. In that assumption, they were correct. No torpedo had hit. No ship had been damaged by their aircraft. The cost in aircraft and crews across the morning had been catastrophic. From a tactical accounting perspective, the numbers were unforgiving. This is important to understand. The crew did not believe they had changed anything. That belief shaped how they remembered the mission for the rest of their lives. As Midway finally appeared on the horizon, the problems multiplied. Landing a damaged B-26 was not routine even under ideal conditions. The aircraft's handling characteristics were already unforgiving. Damage removed what little margin existed. Hydraulic systems were unreliable. Landing gear extension could not be assumed. Brakes might fail on touchdown. Approach speed had to be managed carefully. Too fast, and the aircraft would overrun the runway. Too slow, and it would drop out of the sky. There were no backup aircraft. No alternate field. No rescue force waiting offshore. The landing would either work, or it would not. The pilot committed to the approach. The aircraft crossed the reef line low and fast. Power settings were adjusted by feel rather than by instrument. Control forces changed constantly as airflow interacted with damaged surfaces. The runway rushed toward them. Touchdown was violent. The aircraft stayed upright through a combination of technique and luck that no flight manual could fully explain. Brakes held just long enough. Control inputs countered asymmetric forces just long enough. The B-26 came to a stop. Only then did the adrenaline release. Ground crews counted damage methodically. Holes through structure, systems destroyed or barely functioning, components that had continued working despite no rational reason to do so. The aircraft would never fly again. For the crew, survival did not feel like victory. It felt like exhaustion, relief, mixed with disbelief. They had not expected to return, and they had no explanation for why they had. Their understanding of the mission remained unchanged for years. They believed they had failed. History would take a different view, but not immediately. In the aftermath of Midway, attention focused on the carriers that burned and sank. Dive bomber pilots were celebrated. Strategic analyses concentrated on timing, scouting failures, and command decisions. The B-26 attack occupied a footnote. Aircraft, 2 lost, no hits. It did not fit the narrative of decisive action. But war does not require actions to be recognized to matter. The pressure exerted by earlier attacks, the forced decisions, the narrowed margins, all of it remained part of the causal chain, whether acknowledged or not. The crew of the B-26 returned to duty, believing their mission had achieved nothing. They were not corrected. No one could prove otherwise. The effects of their actions were indirect, distributed, and inseparable from the chaos of the battle itself. That does not diminish what happened. It clarifies it. The mission was not heroic because it succeeded. It mattered because it existed. It existed at the wrong place, at the wrong time, under the wrong conditions, and forced a system already under strain to absorb one more pressure it could not easily resolve. The crew never saw the window they helped open. They only survived long enough for others to pass through it. The B-26 attack at Midway presents an uncomfortable problem for historians. By every conventional measure, it failed. No ships were sunk, no torpedoes hit their targets. Half of the attacking aircraft were lost. From a tactical accounting perspective, the exchange was brutally one-sided. If the story ended there, it would not be remembered. But wars are not decided by tactical accounting alone. They are decided by interaction. The crew of the B-26 did not change the outcome of Midway in isolation. Their actions did not override Japanese doctrine, negate American mistakes, or replace the role of dive bombers that delivered the decisive blows. What they did was contribute to a sequence of pressures that shaped decisions under uncertainty. That distinction matters. Military systems are designed to handle expected threats efficiently. They are far less capable of adapting to simultaneous, unconventional pressures arriving from multiple directions. At Midway, the Japanese carrier force faced exactly that condition. Attacks from different altitudes, from different services, with different objectives, at different times. None of those attacks succeeded on their own. Together, they forced continuous reaction. Reaction consumes time. Reaction consumes attention. Reaction reduces flexibility. By the time the decisive attack arrived, the system had already absorbed more strain than it was designed to tolerate. The B-26 flyover fits into that pattern. It did not create vulnerability by itself. It did not dictate Nagumo's decision-making. It did not guarantee the success of American dive bombers. What it did was reinforce uncertainty at a critical moment. From Nagumo's perspective, Midway was still dangerous. Aircraft were still attacking. Defenses were still being tested. That perception was rational, given the information available at the time. His response followed doctrine. Doctrine failed not because it was wrong, but because it was applied under conditions it had never been designed to address. This is why the B-26 mission resists simple classification. It was not a heroic success. It was not a meaningless sacrifice. It was a tactical failure with strategic weight. That combination is uncomfortable because it challenges how victories are usually explained. History prefers clean narratives. A decisive weapon, a brilliant maneuver, a single turning point. The reality of Midway does not conform to that preference. Midway was decided by accumulation. Accumulated pressure, accumulated uncertainty, accumulated constraint. The B-26 attack was one unit of that accumulation. The crew never claimed otherwise. They did not argue that their mission changed the war. They did not reinterpret their experience to fit a victorious narrative. For them, the facts were simple. The torpedo missed, the aircraft was damaged beyond repair, and survival was the only outcome that mattered. That honesty is part of why the story endures. It reminds us that impact in war is not always visible to the people who create it. Actions interact in ways no single participant can fully observe. Consequences emerge later, at scales larger than individual experience. The B-26 did not need to be decisive to matter. It only needed to exist at a moment when systems were already strained. That is often how wars turn. Not through perfect execution, but through imperfect actions colliding under pressure until one side loses the ability to adapt. The crew of that bomber never saw the collapse they helped precede. They returned believing they had failed. History does not contradict them, it simply places their failure in a wider context. A context where tactical loss and strategic consequence are not opposites. They are often linked.